This lecture discusses the U.S. trade experience, highlighting a few specific tariff and quota policies and the political economy dimensions of these policies. Protectionism in the U.S. is old. Historically, tariffs were used primarily for revenue-generating purposes, and in the late 1700s, they accounted for about 99% of all government revenues. Prior to the 1900s, two tariff periods epitomized the use of tariffs extensively in the United States. This was in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. The former saw tariffs used both for revenue generation and for infant industry protection. The latter was so termed by the South that felt the brunt of the tariffs. These tariffs was designed to protect industries in the North in large part, but this meant both lower exports for products from the South as well as higher priced domestic products produced in the North. In the 1900s, there was one major tariff period, the 1930s Smoot-Hawley tariff, put in place at the height of the Great Depression, designed to provide domestic industries protection, but which backfired as similar measures employed by U.S. trade partners only saw the Great Depression worsen globally. The tariffs were soon after reversed with the passing of the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, by which tariffs with select trading partners would be mutually reduced through bilateral negotiations. This was in effect the precursor to a more international trade agreement. In 1944, the International Trade Organization was proposed but failed to get traction as the United States Congress refused to ratify the provisions it put in place. By 1947, however, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was established with U.S. participation, and several rounds of negotiations afterward led to the establishment of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which was ratified by the U.S. Congress. Besides membership in the WTO, the U.S. also has bilateral trade agreements with several countries and groups of countries, important of which is the regional trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, known as the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, established in 1994. Generally, the main goal behind trade agreements is to negotiate reductions in all forms of trade barriers existing across countries, chiefly tariffs. The main reason for this, as we have painstakingly walked through, is that in the aggregate, countries realize that there are gains to be made from trade liberalization. As a result, the several rounds of negotiations that have taken place under the GATT, for instance, have led to global reductions in tariffs, such that in terms of tariff reductions, these trade agreements have been largely successful. However, there are still some markets where tariffs still persist, and in many other areas, while tariffs have come down, they seem to have been replaced by NTBs in more subtle forms. This table shows us data from 1990, which is a little dated, but much of this structure is largely in place as of today. It shows us the economic effect of U.S. import tariffs on some selected industries. The second column provides the average ad valorem tariff in that industry. The third column shows the cost of the tariff in terms of the loss in consumer surplus. Column 4 shows the revenues generated by the government, column 5 the increase in producer surplus afforded by the tariff protection, and column 6 shows the deadweight loss from the policy. These are all in millions of US dollars. The last column shows the consumer cost per job saved, and this is measured in thousands of dollars. As you can see, the tariffs are very costly to the US economy. For instance, consider the ceramic tiles industry. The tariffs we have in place create a deadweight loss of $2 million, and each job preserved in this industry on average costs consumers $401,000. That is about 8 times the per capita income in the United States. In the luggage industry, the deadweight loss is even so much larger at $26 million, and the cost per job is pretty much close to $1 million. Recall when discussing tariffs, we noted there are different types of tariffs. The US employs all three types, sometimes within the same industry. We have here a sample of the tariff schedule for 2012. We show next some of the current tariffs, again for 2012, on select industries. Listed are average tariffs, along with the maximum tariffs within these industries. These are listed in general and for MFN applied rates. For example, on footwear, leather and so on, the average tariff is 3.9%, but it's as high as 55% within that same industry on some products. Where the tariffs were negotiated under the WTO and as such bound by MFN, the average tariffs are 3.7%, but yet as high as 60%. How are trade agreements implemented? For the United States, the executive arm of government normally negotiates trade agreements, including tariff reductions. However, whatever agreement was negotiated by the US has to be ratified by Congress for it to be official. If Congress fails to ratify it, it's not official and the US is not bound by the agreements it reached. The law is then modified to be consistent with the agreements once Congress has ratified any such tariff agreements. Some of the important landmark acts passed by Congress regarding trade include the U.S. Tariff Act of 1930. Among other things, this act included provisions for when and how anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties may be applied. The laws were amended more recently to include sunset provisions, as required by the Uruguay round of negotiations under the GATT. A sunset provision allows for a periodic, in this case 5-year, review of any existing duties to see if they should still be continued or revoked. The U.S. Trade Act of 1974 is another important act passed, and it includes, among other things, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, which provides aid to workers displaced from their jobs or affected by reduction in hours or wages due to increased imports. This is in the spirit of providing the redistribution necessary to make the aggregate gains from trade beneficial for those who bear the initial losses. Section 201 of the Act provides for protectionist relief consistent with the GATT Escape Clause provisions. Section 421 of the Act is a China-specific safeguard, which expired in 2013. This provided for some protectionist policies to support import competing industries in the United States upon China's joining of the WTO and the expected large-scale imports from China that would result, since that was considered to be potentially destabilizing to the US economy. To see how some of these have operated in practice, in 2002, the Bush administration imposed tariffs on steel from abroad. Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974 was invoked as necessary and consistent with the escape clause provisions of the GATT. Some countries appealed to the WTO, complaining that this was unfair. The World Trade Organization ruled against the United States and permitted the countries to retaliate. As a result, the Bush administration acted to remove the tariffs. In 2009, the Obama administration imposed tariffs on Chinese tires, invoking Section 421 of the Trade Act of 1974. China retaliated with tariffs on select US exports into China. A small trade war resulted. Again, the WTO came in to resolve that and ruled in favor of the United States in 2011. trucking ban had been in place effectively since 2009 in the United States, after a pilot program that had granted Mexican trucks partial access had come to an end. This was despite the NAFTA agreement in 1995 that was supposed to permit full access to Mexican truckers into the United States. Mexico retaliated with tariffs on US products, and in 2011 the Obama administration ended the truck ban, permitting some form of controlled access by Mexican trucks after meeting certain requirements into the United States. When it comes to NTBs, the most notorious in the US are quotas, which still exist on sugar imports, and up until 2005 existed for textile imports. In the 1980s, a VER was in place on Japanese automobiles, which led to higher quality Japanese imports selling at the resulting higher price the protectionist policy offered, along with their US counterparts that offered no equivalent quality upgrades. The long-run effect which showed up in the relatively higher durability of these foreign vehicles in the used vehicle market. Keep in mind though that the WTO prohibits quotas of all kinds, including VERs, yet they have persisted in many countries, including the United States. In general then, we see that US trade policy has been marked by both movements toward freer trade and continued forms of protectionism. The tensions between these clearly being the result of the inherent political nature of the policy process. Often in these debates there are arguments used to justify protectionist policies, and I summarize some of them here. The possibility that they could be welfare improving, that they could protect viable infant industries, that they could generate revenues especially for developing countries with low incomes, that they are required for national defense, that they allow for senile industries to close down gradually, that they preserve jobs, and finally, that they involve great social injustice, whether through encouraging exploitation of developing countries or through the adverse effect it has on low-income earners in rich countries. This course so far has suggested that all of these arguments can be debunked. So let's address each one in turn. The welfare improving possibility of protectionist policies at best is short-lived, as trade partners suffering terms of trade losses will retaliate. In any case, we have explained that those outcomes are exceptions and not the rule. When looking at infant industry arguments, we also pointed out that protectionist policies do not overcome the market failures that dodge the environment in which these industries are expected to thrive in. Tariffs as a source of revenue, while historically true for most developed countries in their early periods of development, do not make them efficient for any country. If incomes are low and cannot be effectively taxed, it does not help that tariffs are imposed which ultimately lead to higher prices on those products. Further, there is always an accompanying deadweight loss, so that for a developing country, this is not an efficient policy recommendation. National defense is absolutely important, but providing domestic subsidies for industries associated with national defense is a better, less inefficient measure than any of the protectionist policies, including export subsidies, which are different from domestic subsidies. Senile industries are those industries which in the past might have had a comparative advantage but now have lost it, and in which many individuals might have had their fortunes tied up in, because their labor and capital might have been highly specific to these industries. The problem with providing protection to these industries is that they become politically entrenched and never go away. So the inefficient policy and production continue with no clear rationale for it other than political. The jobs preservation argument also does not hold true. Trade distributes jobs, doesn't reduce jobs. For when jobs are lost in some industries as they close down, the resulting cheaper imports allows for consumers to spend on other goods in other industries that thrive, and because they are now expanding production, are also looking to hire workers. Finally, the misconceptions about trade being associated with social injustice is exactly that, a misconception. Trade does not exploit low-income economies, but rather allows for them to raise their living standards as their wages rise. For low-income workers in high-income economies, admitted they are harmed, but it need not be permanent since the gains from trade allow for them to be fully compensated for their losses. This is more a distributional issue that responsible governments should address through policy, and the TAA program in the US is a step in the right direction. We are now done with this lecture, the second module, and the first part of the course on trade theory and policy. Take the quiz associated with this lecture. Reflect on all you have learned and get ready to start the second part of the course, which is international finance.